Today we're going to talk about laboratory systems commissioning. I'm going to glance over GMP and what that means as it relates to manufacturing, biotech, laboratories. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it because it's a pretty in-depth topic that has its own, should be its own session. But I'm going to glance over it today, and I'm also going to talk about kind of, why is laboratory commissioning a cool thing? It's unique. There's a lot of systems and labs that you're not going to traditionally see in an office building or something more simplistic. So first off, I want to apologize. I'm going to throw a ton of acronyms at you. Some of them you've seen, some of them you haven't. Some of them mean something else to somebody else. But to get it started here, current good manufacturing practices, that's cGMP. Basically, the FDA regulates certain things. And based on those things they regulate, which are typically food, drugs, ingestible products, medical device industries, they have some regulations of how they expect those systems or processes to be designed, monitored, and controlled. Current, which is the small c in cGMP, really says we want to keep this forward thinking. We don't want this to be a stagnant effort. It's a quality-based process that needs to continue to grow. And the only way it can continue to grow is to find new technologies and stay up with the latest trends. If you're not complying with cGMP, you can be in a world of hurt. The FDA does do audits, and they can shut you down. They can fine you heavily for not complying with these regulations. So it's important that you understand why there's GMP, why there's all these inspections. But at the end of the day, it's really there to help keep us as consumers safe. There has to be a quality aspect to making a drug or to using a medical device that's going to test your blood. All these things are critical, and if things go wrong, it can hurt people. So cGMP is there as a quality control process to make sure that you and I don't get hurt from these products. So as I said, there's, this is some examples of regulated industries, market sectors. That hot dog you might like to eat, well, they got to make it a certain way, and we got to make sure it's safe. Medical devices, drugs, pharmaceutical is a huge part of this, and it's a very large sector where cGMP is relevant. And then ingestible products like cosmetics, that smelly thing that your wife might put on her skin, that's probably regulated by the FDA. So I'm a commissioner. And by the way, I use commissioner because no one understands what a commissioning agent is. So when people ask me, I just tell them I'm Commissioner Conway. So feel free to call me Commissioner Conway. When you're doing commissioning for cGMP spaces and equipment, you have to think about it as a mission-critical process. The data center industry did a great job of defining these level 1 through 5 testing requirements as it relates to commissioning, and a lot of that is, the objective is to catch it early. And it's no different with GMP systems in critical laboratories. That 1 through 5 level, if you're familiar with data center commissioning, is very similar in cGMP. That being said, there are additional steps that are going to be different than your typical lead or ASHRAE commissioning process. It's a very documentation-heavy process. They want tracked and proved everything. It's going to be a full review process. Your scope's going to go up. It's going to take you more time. And another big change, a big learning curve when stepping into GMP commissioning is you're no longer the last guy checking it. Commissioning shows up on most projects. We test the air handler, we walk away, that's it. Well, if that's a direct impact system that is impacting a product that's being manufactured, there's going to be a whole nother level of testing through qualification and validation, and other consultants that are going to come in after you, and they're going to run it through even more tests and more rigor. So you're not the last guy, and that's kind of a change from what we're used to. As I said, documentation is the killer. It's very important you use good documentation practices, GDP. It's another acronym. GDP is a way of filling out documents that ensures authenticity and accuracy. The idea is they don't want, if the FDA comes in and they do an audit on your facility, they want them to be able to understand what they're reading. It's a way of holistically making things, the same across the United States and even Europe has these. But what it's going to do is it's going to tell you how you need to fill out your commissioning documentation. With GDP, you can pretty much throw away your iPad, your Surface, your electronics. You're not going to use them. This is going to be wet ink. You're going to have a piece of paper. It's going to be a blue or black ballpoint pen. Can't be non-bleed ink. There's very specific requirements for how this documentation is filled out. Every entry, has to be dated, signed. There's a specific, order to this. And you might say, wow, this is a lot of work. Why the hell would I want to do that? Well, what I've found is that the process works. And regardless if the documentation might be a pain, it's a very thorough process. And it can translate to typical commissioning. So we talked about what GMP is. We talked about, good documentation practices. How do I know what a GMP system is? How do I know how do I find this information? Well, every project is going to have a site impact assessment done. And what the impact assessment's doing is looking at the product. It's saying, hey, we're making coconut oil. And if I'm making coconut oil, there's certain systems that are used to make that coconut oil. And maybe there's an air handling system that is used to condition the space where they make that coconut oil. They're looking at the product and they're saying, how do all of these ancillary systems, all these utilities affect my process? So as a quick example, I'm gonna go through. We did an air handling system for a cosmetic manufacturer. This was in Los Angeles. The warehouse was a GMP warehouse. It was storing product that was considered, regulated by the FDA. And based on the impact assessment, what they found was, well, the space temperature in that space is directly impacting the product. If that product gets out of a certain range, which they defined as 65 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, if the space gets outside of that range, that product can be negatively impacted, and you might have to throw that product away. So it's mission critical for this millions of dollars, multi-millions of dollars of product within this warehouse to be between these temperatures. Now, what they also found was that the air handling system, although it's conditioning the space, it is not directly impacting product. If the air handling system wasn't running, we'd probably be okay. It's LA, 65 to 90 most of the year. Maybe it doesn't even need to run. However, it does indirectly impact that product. So based on that information, we know that we're going to have to commission both of those things, the space temperature and the air handling system. However, the space temperature is going to go through a lot more rigor as far as what's the next step. Well, after commissioning, now they have to do a qualification study. The qualification study that we did for this project involved a temperature mapping study where we put temperature sensors throughout the space. I think there's about 100 temperature sensors, wireless data loggers, and we looked at air movement in the space. We looked at stratification. They had tall racks, maybe 40 feet tall, where they're storing product. And we want to make sure that the product at the top is also getting to the temperature that the product on the bottom has. So that's a quick overview. Another document in this world is the URS, or User Requirement Specification. So the URS is, to me, it's like an OPR, a BOD, and a user requirement all in one document related to a piece of equipment. So you're going to get a URS for this air handling system. And some highlights, it's going to say, here's your capacity, here's some excess capacity, here is some information from their EH&S department. They say, well, if it's more than 80 decibels around the equipment, within 5 feet of the equipment, we need hearing protection. So as a commissioning agent, they want us to go around and take sound level tests and say, okay, we're good. We're at 75 decibels. Your staff, your maintenance people don't have to wear hearing protection. So they're using the commissioning process a little bit differently than some people do. It's really, energy is important, but in these mission critical applications, it's much more important that it's stable and safe, quality-based, risk-based. So additionally, it'll point out some things. They had space temperature. They also have space humidity. Well, the humidity control is specifically for occupant comfort in the space. It doesn't affect the product. That's stuff we need to know when we're filling out our documentation that that doesn't directly impact the product. And then obviously they wanted us to have all of our commissioning documentation meet GMP and GDP standards. Leveraging. So in a typical commissioning process, we might say, let's get your startup report for the VFD, and let's get your startup report for the air handling system or the boiler. And based on that information, we might know some better information to be able to commission that. What they do in this world is a similar thing. It's a leveraging process where you can say, maybe my commissioning, my installation checklist where I go through and I make sure that the electrical breakers are set right and the conductors to the air handling system are tightened and the fan spins the right way and there's safe access, all these things. They can take that documentation, and if it meets GDP, if it's documented correctly, good documentation practices, they can leverage that into what they call qualification. And that's the next step in the process, installation qualification. I can take that and I can say, here you go, owner. This document is good enough to show the FDA that you're complying. And they can take that information, they can put the stamp of approval on the top of it, and they might use that as documentation for future audits. So leveraging documentation is just a way of reducing repeat work. And I think it's important. If they're going to do a site acceptance test on the air handling system, there's no point in me coming in and doing it all over again. Well, I should be there, be part of that, or even put information in the site acceptance test early in the project to where I can show up and make sure that I can get my stuff done at that time. Earlier you catch it, the better. So commissioning protocol format, real quick, just this is the basic thing they're looking for. There's an item number, what are you testing, how are you going to do it, what's the acceptance criteria, what's the result, does it pass, and who are you? Quick case study. We did a project for a pharmaceutical company. It was a GMP cold room space, and we did the commissioning and qualification for the room. As part of that, just to put this in perspective of the amount of effort that this simple system, I mean, we're talking a cold box with a temperature sensor in it and a couple DX units, lead lag that maintain temperature control. For us to do the commissioning and the temperature mapping study, it was weeks of effort and a binder about this thick of paperwork. So it can be a lot of effort to do these things and to get the documentation completed and done right. But it is worth it. It's worth it to the owners, and the biggest and best part of it is that if we catch it during commissioning and it doesn't go to qualification or their validation team to fix, if anything comes up during that process that doesn't meet the expected result, there's a huge change control process where they have to go back to the beginning. They have to go through tons of paperwork in order to get that done. It's a very expensive process. So if we can catch it in commissioning, it makes a huge world of difference. Some things we learned on this is when we were doing our temperature mapping study, this cold room was storing liquid vials. And what we actually did is we took all of our wireless data loggers and we put them in a glycol solution that simulated a thermal buffer that actually, it helps smooth transitions in temperature and fluctuations. It also helps to kind of create a more real-world scenario of how whatever's being stored in that cold room, in this case liquid vials, are going to be affected by temperature. So it's good practice when doing freezer monitoring or cold temperature monitoring of cold rooms or anything like that to use a thermal buffer around the temperature sensor. Another thing we found is there was condensation in the inside of the cold box from electrical penetrations that hadn't been sealed. We found gasketing issues around the cold door itself to where air was being infiltrated into the cold room. So when you're doing this, it's kind of more than, it's almost a little bit of enclosure testing as well, making sure that thing's going to stay cool. So transitioning a little bit away from GMP, I'll say that one of the coolest parts of working in mission critical laboratories, things of this nature, is that you get to touch some pretty cool processes. You get to commission cool systems, and if you're like me, you get bored, man. You don't want to commission the same thing over and over. I hate package air handling systems. I don't even want to look at them. This is a case study we did for a Neuroscience lab in San Diego, and what they were doing is they were using high-performance liquid chromatography, HPLC systems, for analytical chemistry research. And basically what they were doing is they're looking at blood, and what the HPLCs allow them to do is separate things within that into their own areas, and they can analyze specific areas of that blood. As part of that process, they required some solvents to be pumped into the system to make that work. So for this specific solvent system, they were using acetonitrile and methanol. Basically what we've got here is on this wall, on this side, is where these totes are stored. These totes are your acetonitrile, your methanol, that come in on a wheeled into the space. They come in and they sit on these weight scales here, and then they're connected to the solvent piping system. This system had a Rockwell-based control system that did all the monitoring and control of the pneumatic systems. We had a high compressed air that were controlling pneumatic valves, diaphragm pumps. We had heavy monitoring of oxygen content within the space, VOCs. There's a lot of safeties involved with these systems. Because of the fact that the supply chain was in an H3 hazard level space, all of the totes and all that things, we had a high level of monitoring to make sure that there wasn't any issues in there. So kind of the way it worked, I just want to talk through, and we'll kind of hit in some commissioning lessons learned, is they used nitrogen. There's a bulk nitrogen tank out in the yard, liquid nitrogen, goes through vaporizes to gas. That gas is then pumped into the solvent system. Nitrogen pressurizes these tanks. So these are the tanks I showed you on the slide before. And what they do is they roll them onto these weight scales. The weight scales then are calculated to the tank level. They say if I'm at 15 pounds based on the volume of the scale and the density of the liquid, I'm at this level in the tank. And these valves are used to control the tank levels. So they open and close based on the demand in the space. Secondly, they had a backup nitrogen system. So if the main system failed, a low pressure sensor would open. During commissioning, we actually went out there and we just shut off the bulk nitrogen system. The low pressure switch opened. These valves here switched positions, and they went to a backup nitrogen system that allowed their processes to be continued. Some of these processes are very expensive to run, and if you fail it right in the middle of the experiment, it's no good. So try to reduce that at all costs. So the supply system pumps into the actual laboratory. Within the laboratory, we've got these secondary storage tank systems. And basically, there's 4 different tanks for different HPLCs, different laboratory benches around the space. And These, again, have weight scales, leak detection systems within the cabinets, and these valves are used to modulate and maintain liquid level within the secondary storage tanks. It's an unpressurized system, so it's important that we maintain those tank levels, and in the event of a spillover, we have alarms and global shutdowns of the process, et cetera. So after the HPLCs use that solvent, it's dirty, it's nasty, we've got to get it out of there. They have their own internal pumping system that pumps that solvent into some waste tanks that are located in biosafety cabinets within the lab. Similarly, they have a primary and secondary tank. The primary tank is used to fill. Once that fill gets up to a high level, the control system says, okay, I got to kick on this diaphragm pump. And the diaphragm pump pumps the waste back to the main solvent waste system. The reason that diaphragm pumps are used is these are intrinsically safe biosafety cabinets. You can have any electricity in there. It's all pneumatically driven, and that's very important based on the chemistry makeup. Secondly, if we get into this backup tank, we pretty much know that the diaphragm pump has failed. If we start filling this primary tank up too high, gets to overflow level, something's wrong with this pump, and we're obviously not pumping any water. So if we saw any solvent in the backup tank, that was basically a bad thing, and we shut the whole system down as well. Bulk waste, 4 bulk waste tanks. They basically stage with these valves. If this one gets too high, we close it, we open the next one, and that tells the facilities team, hey, we've got tank A is full, and let's get that out of here. Let's quick disconnect that, get it out, put a new tank in, and keep going. So from a commissioning standpoint, this was a really fun thing to commission, just due to the complexity and the levels of alarm scenarios. There was some great lessons learned, and one of them was that when we commissioned this, we commissioned it with water. And we did that because it was just easier for us to use water than it was solvents. Solvents are expensive, they're also dangerous. There's a whole level of complexity once you get solvent in the system that their environmental health and safety department is looking at where we can't do certain things. The biggest thing that affected that was that the volume, the weight per liter of water is different than acetonitrile or different than acetone. So the way that the weight scales are programmed, they said, well, here's my weight. I'm 15 pounds. Well, if I'm water, sure, my tank level's here, but maybe if I'm acetonitrile, my tank level's here. So we actually had to put in some programming during commissioning, which converted all those calculations within the PLC logic to allow us to properly set the tank levels based on water. That was something that, as a commissioning agent, I think we overlooked and didn't think about properly, but when you're commissioning any system that's not using the exact product that it's intended for, you got to make sure your commissioning plan highlights that. This is something where the controls, the PLC vendor said, well, that's going to take me a day to reprogram, and they charged the owner for that. It was something that was outside of their scope to do. So it's important that you get that stuff figured out. Secondly, diaphragm pumps can be very difficult to balance. These pumps were, it was not they're a pump system. It was a small amount of head, a small amount of flow, but the way that those pumps change based on air pressure is really dramatic. So we actually had to change the pressure reducing valves in the system during commissioning because we couldn't get the flow low enough based on that low amount of pressure we needed to get that pump spinning properly. Another thing, we had a networked leak detection system where every sensor out in the field had a comm wire to it and communicated kind of MSTP across the chain. We had a lot of issues with those sensors, and I would highly recommend that you use individual inputs instead of a networked system. There was issues with lag time as it related to actually detecting water. We also had a lot of issues with the setup and testing of the system. And then secondly, if you're using pneumatic systems, This one we had a air compressor. Compressed air came into a manifolded system, and solenoid valves would then take that and shoot air out to the different pneumatic valves for control. This one they had polytube connections at the manifold, and it was wreaking havoc. They were coming loose. The valves weren't opening, closing properly. So if you're going to use pneumatic systems for mission critical applications, use copper. Do it right. Hard connections. Big picture of this presentation, I could get into tons of case studies, things like that, but at the end of the day, it's all about broadening our horizons. There's a lot of systems that we commission that are outside your typical MEP that we find tons of issues with, and I'm sure that's no surprise. But the difference is in this world, you might say, Commissioner Conway, I got this RFP, and all it says is I got to commission the mechanical systems. And well, yeah, it's true, but that doesn't stop you from teaching your client. Put a line item on your proposal that says, well, in our experience, this is great, but you should also commission these 10 systems because we've seen tons of failure rates with them, or they're highly critical, and we should be commissioning those. In general, labs are a great space for this. You've got compressed air systems, you've got clean water, DI, soft water, you've got autoclaves, and you name it. There's tons of process systems, custom process systems for commissioning. But it's not just labs, healthcare facilities, even an office building, we could be probably doing more than we traditionally are as far as the scope of work. And that's a shift. It's a shift in the thinking. It's a shift in the industry. And traditionally, that comes from the top down, right? The top down, we get an RFP, and we do what we need to do based on that. But I believe that there's a huge opportunity to be going beyond our typical realm of scope of services. And the way it's going to get there is to teach our peers, teach our bosses, teach our clients. They need to understand the importance of this, and you need to show them, you need to quantify it and show them why. I see it as a huge opportunity, and I hope we can get there. So that's all I have for today. Appreciate your time.